Hi, thanks everybody for coming out in the middle of the day. I'm going to read a really short segment from the book, and I'm reading this in part because for those of you who've been paying attention to the rhetoric of the past couple of weeks, not just the Kavanaugh hearings themselves, but the aftermath, and the way that the president, members of the Senate Judiciary, and members of the right-wing media on Fox News have been casting what has just happened as a sort of mob, chaotic, disruptive attack on Brett Kavanaugh and on the Republican Party. I'm going to read a section that I think speaks to some of that rhetoric, although it was written about last fall and the sort of peak of the hashtag #MeToo movement in the fall, and how a lot of the concern was that things were chaotic and out of control, that the allegations were coming fast and furious, that there wasn't a sort of quality control on them, that things were moving very quickly and with a kind of velocity and intensity that was disruptive and upsetting. And I'm going to read just a short passage about that and the idea that a challenge to power and its abuses is inherently chaotic. Chaos was what former Senator Barbara Mikulski had remembered in 1991 when the women of the House had banged on the door and insisted that Senate Leader George Mitchell talk to them about letting Anita Hill testify against Clarence Thomas. There was a sense that the whole process, if not spinning out of control, was getting very chaotic, Mikulski remembered of that day in an oral history, in which Hill herself recalled that Senator Mitchell's approach had been, let's keep things under control, under his control. The women's insistence that they get to talk, and that they got to insist that Hill get to tell her story, was the moment that George Mitchell lost control. Yes, things were out of control. That was the point. Because control was when no one was able to report the story of Harvey Weinstein raping women. Control was Donald Trump getting elected president thanks to voter suppression and the electoral college systems designed to suppress and thus better control non-white populations. Control was the unchallenged reigns of Bill O'Reilly and Roger Ailes and Bill Cosby. Control was women being too terrified to defend Eric Schneiderman by telling of how he'd hit them. Control was ensuring that no one cared about the abuses sustained by Ford factory employees or flight attendants. Control was all male presidents and vice presidents. Control was only 2 black women senators and no black women governors in the history of the country. Control was marital rape being legal into the 70s. Control was slavery and locking women in unsafe shirtwaist factories. And women, ordinary women, understood this. The pollster Tressa Undum, carefully tracking Americans' attitudes about gender, told me in 2017 that her polling had shown a huge majority of voters, 86%, who connected the notions of harassment and assault to a, quote, desire for power and control over women. Undum told me that she'd also seen a very sudden and striking shift after years of polling on reproductive rights. For the first time, she had begun to hear voters use the words control and controlling women when discussing efforts to restrict their access to abortion and to contraception. To some extent, women who wanted liberty and equality knew they had to create some chaos. And yes, it was moving with such velocity and intensity that it was terrifying in its unpredictability. But it had to be radical and wrathful and energetic to get people to pay attention and to actually alter the power dynamics. Rules had to be changed, as they had been changed in the second wave, when marriages entered into on unequal terms were no longer acceptable, and the fact that some of them ended was a sudden shock to the system, and some men felt that they had been unfairly victimized by swiftly changing expectations. Now butt-groping and salacious come-ons and harassment were no longer going to be acceptable, and some men were going to lose their jobs, and some of them would no doubt feel that they had been unfairly victimized. But this was what it meant to say that we wanted the world to be different. Not in some hazy future after all the old, not different men had retired from their perches and died peacefully in their sleep. We wanted it to be different now, and that meant dethroning some of them early. Things had to get out of control. The law cannot do it for us, Shirley Chisholm had said. We must do it for ourselves. Women in this country must become revolutionaries.
You packed a lot into that passage.
That was when I wrote that passage at the most frenzied peak of my own writing this book.
I mean, it captures a sense of this moment. I mean, how much is at stake? How much has changed and is changing right now? But to me, the really extraordinary thing about your book is how much it puts what we're dealing with right now in historical context. And this idea of control and versus action is really important. I mean, you connect all of these historical moments, suffrage, abolition, civil rights, the labor movement, all of these moments when women rebelled against this idea of being quiet, of avoiding being termed hysterical, and actually, took action out of anger. Can you talk a little bit about when you started to think about anger as a connective tissue between all these moments in history?
Yeah, I started to think about anger as the framework through which to look at a lot of the history and contemporary politics that I cover as a journalist. I really only started to think about it through the framework of considering anger really in the winter of 2016, 2017. And there had been anger that had undergirded a lot of my work. I've been working as a feminist journalist, writing about gendered inequality, racial inequality, economic inequality for 15 years. And so, of course, if you'd asked me, I would have said, sure, a lot of my work begins with anger at what I perceive to be injustice and at stark inequality. But I also, if somebody had asked, I probably also would have said, yeah, I also understand that there are risks in presenting as too angry, and I've, most women in the world, have taken pains to modulate my own voice as a writer and in social and professional situations, because we know that expressing anger directly comes with costs and censure. The types of costs and censure, of course, depend on our relative positions in the world, on our race, on our economic power, on our professional power. But I hadn't really thought of anger as any kind of organizing principle of my work, and certainly not of a look into women's history. And there was a period between the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and his inauguration in 2017 when I was really trying to figure out, okay, as a feminist journalist, what is my job going forward? What's the story I'm supposed to tell? What's my work here? And I was having a conversation with my husband where I was expressing my incredible frustration. I felt like my brain was boiling over and I couldn't think clearly. I didn't know what my job was. I didn't know what I was supposed to do moving into this administration. And I said to him conversationally, I want to know what I'm supposed to be doing, but I'm too angry to think straight. And he said, well, maybe you should write about anger. And it was just this mild suggestion. My husband is not a journalist. It was a personal suggestion. And as soon as he said it, I was like, right, no, that's what I should write about. I should write about anger. And because I had done historical research for my last book, which was about unmarried women, where partway through writing a book about unmarried women, I'd realized that there was this remarkable history of women living outside of marriage in the United States. And it wound up taking me 3 additional years of research to go back and learn a lot of the history that I'd never been taught. And I learned some of the history of the suffrage movement and of the labor movement, as well as the more morally driven movements and conservative movements, the temperance movement and Phyllis Schlafly. I'd learned a lot of that history from my last book. But as soon as I began to think about how anger was so crucial to the dynamics that were swirling around us in 2016, 2017, and obviously since, I also suddenly saw some of that history that I'd only recently learned and been like, oh my God, anger was key then too. But women's anger was catalytic, was propulsive at the start of so many of these movements, and we're never taught that. We're very rarely taught about the women who were in the start of those movements to begin with. And then the ones we are taught about, when we're taught about Rosa Parks, for instance, who is acknowledged to be catalytic within the civil rights movement. We are taught about her as being, stoic and exhausted. I was always taught, and maybe for the undergraduates here now, because in recent years there has been an excavation of the actual history of Rosa Parks, maybe the education that you're getting now is better and different on this front. But when I was taught about Rosa Parks, she was prim, quiet. The major thing I was taught about her was that she was a seamstress. In fact, Rosa Parks was a lifelong furious fighter for civil rights and against racial injustice. She was an investigator for the NAACP who investigated the gang rapes of black women by white men and claims of sexual assault made by white women against black men. She was motivated throughout her life by an anger at racial injustice and racial violence, and her choice to sit on the bus in Montgomery in 1955 was a deeply politicized, intentional act of civil disobedience. But any anger that undergirded her life's work, which became so explosively crucial to a civil rights movement that would change our laws, has been obscured under a veneer of peaceability, respectability in traditionally feminized terms that determine what respectability entails, and a vision of her as quiet, stoic, and tired, which is much more comfortable than the idea that, in fact, she was disruptive, determined, and angry. And so, I mean, that's just one example, but you can basically go back through all of the social movements that have transformed this country, to my mind, for the better, and many of them that have transformed them for the worse, and find that women's anger has been a really potent and politically consequential force. And so that was some of the history I was trying to unearth. And because I had learned a lot of that history relatively recently in my adulthood, I kind of had it at hand and was like, oh, right, the Lowell mill workers in the 1830s. We think of the labor movement as a white male movement in many ways, except for teacher unionism, which we acknowledge as a political force. But the sort of history of a labor movement is often presented as a history of coal miners and teamsters. In fact, some of the first iterations of a labor movement were the young women working in New England textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, who formed one of the nation's first unions and staged some of the first walkouts, furious about the horrible working conditions and low wages that they were earning. They also happened to form one of the first women's abolition societies in the country, and that was in the 1830s. And they used the angry language borrowed from the founders of, so our forefathers resisted the bloody avarice of the British government, so we resist the abuses of our employers. But that's history of a sort of eruptive and righteous fury that we're just not taught as part of our historical canon in the United States in the way that we are taught about that rage of the founders.
Right. Well, I was going to say male rage is received very differently.
Well, white male rage is received very differently. That is the political anger that we revere, that we, to a degree, we fetishize in this country, is the rage of the founding, and give me liberty or give me death, live free or die, throwing tea into a harbor, which definitely, if women had done it, would have been a temper tantrum. That's the stuff that's our founding narrative. And so many of the instances later, but the men who were furious about their lack of representation within the government that was taxing and policing them. And what did they do? And their fury at that lack of representation prompted them to make a break, a revolution, have a war, make a break with that government. And then out of that fury was birthed a new country. And what did they do when they built the new country? They codified various forms of exactly the kind of lack of representation and worse forms for this new country. So they enslaved an entire population and they kept an entire other population without the franchise or without legal or political or economic ability to participate equally in the new country. And they built the new country and its government, its laws, its economy on the labor of enslaved people and on the domestic labor of women who didn't have any kind of rights to equal legal or economic or political participation. And one of the things that I found is that so they basically subjugated a majority. The country is founded on a kind of minority rule and all kinds of mechanisms put in place, from the way that the Senate is designed to the Electoral College, to preserve the power of that minority over its majority. When members of the majority have expressed their fury using sometimes the very same language that the founders used in expressing their fury at England, it has not been received as warmly. It is not passed on to us in the history books with the same kind of righteous admiration. But that's the language. In the 1770s, a woman named Mum Bet, who was later known as Elizabeth Freeman, who was an enslaved woman in Massachusetts, was working enslaved in the home of a man who was engaged in revolutionary politics. And she was abused in that home. The woman, the man's wife, hit her with a hot kitchen implement. And she applied the rhetoric that she was hearing in her home, the rhetoric of revolution, to her own circumstance and petitioned for her freedom. And she won her freedom, and her case became the basis for the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts in 1783. That's not a story that many of us, how many people in this room had heard of Mum Bet? A couple of people. But that's actually, it's fascinating that we don't know that, because it's one person, but her case winds up being the basis for the abolition of slavery in a key state. But that's never passed on to us as a righteous example of using the same kind of rhetoric of political rage to legal, long-lasting effect.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't heard of her before I read your book. And I feel like the book is full of those extraordinary moments, or even things like the sort of Lowell, and Shirtwaist Triangle Factory girls. I mean, these are forces that changed American history, and they never really are added up in our history books. They're like footnotes.
Right, we don't, that's the thing is, we spend a lot of time writing off the various forms of women's anger as hysterical, as crazy and unhinged and unpleasant to listen to. Often if that fury is voiced by black women, it's rendered dangerous, threatening, or in some cases sort of comical and cartoonish and reduced to caricature. But we don't spend time thinking about how that rage, when funneled into political action, has actually reshaped things like whether slavery is legal or not in a given state. Or in the case of the Lowell mill strikers are in the 1830s. In 1909, it's a woman named Clara Lemlich, who is one of the many young women working in textile factories and garment factories in New York City, who calls for the strike of 20,000 at Cooper Union. And it's a strike against the shirtwaist factories in the city. And 20,000 people go out on strike, and they actually win new contracts with better working conditions and higher wages at most of the shirtwaist factories in New York City. One of the shirtwaist factories that does not give in to the strikers' demands is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and it burns in 1911, and 146 people are killed, either burned alive or jumping out the windows to their death on the sidewalk. The majority of them are women. The vast majority of them are women. And in the wake of that fire, a radical organizer from the Lower East Side named Rose Schneiderman gives a speech at a memorial for the dead. And it's one of the angriest speeches you'll ever read. I recommend that everybody go and read Rose Schneiderman's speech from 1911. And it begins with, "There are girls burned alive in this city every week." And she's basically rebuking a relatively well-heeled crowd who's there for the memorial service and calling for a workers' movement. And saying, I can't expect fellowship from any of you because you've paid no attention to this, and look at these women who are dead and they're dying every week, and we need to have a workers' movement. Rose Schneiderman goes on, alongside Frances Perkins, who many of you probably know is a member of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's cabinet, to work on the workplace protections, some of the workplace safety protections that are still in place today. But we are never taught about that rage. Frances Perkins also witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and was so horrified and furious by what she saw that she changed the course of her career to work on that workplace safety legislation. And it's just bananas to me that we are never sort of taught, like, oh, we have points of egress and non-flammable materials stacked against the walls, in part because there were women who were so livid at the tolls of this kind of power abuse by the wealthy, that they dedicated their careers to actually changing the laws and putting in place codified protections that still protect all of us today, and yet we're never taught about them.
Well, and part of the reason it's so distressing to not have learned about it is that knowing this kind of gives us permission.
Right. Well, it puts in, so what we're told all the time still, and this is what we are being told right now in these weeks, right? Protesters yelled during the vote for Kavanaugh this weekend, and a Fox News commentator or host maybe referred to them as screaming animals. Donald Trump called the protesters a mob and compared them to arsonists. Marco Rubio called them a mob. Before that, but even before the assault allegations brought by Christine Blasey Ford, the protesters who were in the gallery during the first set of hearings, right? Women who were standing up, yelling about our new future, in which it is very likely that abortion will be made illegal again, in which collective bargaining will be further gutted, voting rights will be further gutted, affirmative action, what's left of it, will be rolled back, yelling about these issues and the likely direction of the court. Orrin Hatch, who sits on the Senate Judiciary Committee, referred to a woman who was yelling, and what she was yelling was, if health care is repealed, I will die. And what Orrin Hatch said in response to this woman was, can somebody get this loudmouth out of here? We shouldn't have to put up with this. Later, Ben Sasse, another senator, held forth on how the women who'd been yelling about accessibility to abortion as a life and death issue, he said, for decades, women have been screaming about how they're going to die if they don't have abortion. Well, that's hysteria. He used the word hysteria. Right? So every day the messages that come toward us, and they come even, by the way, they also come from the left, and a number of people saying, well, doesn't this make us look bad? The reframing of protest and of anger at inequality and anger at injustice as itself the attack on the powerful, right? That's why Donald Trump is apologizing to Brett Kavanaugh's family for having been, what they've suffered. It is, and this is a reversal of power that happens in all kinds of realms, and I've been obsessed with it actually ever since I noticed when Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore. He was taken on a rough ride by police, and he died of his injuries. And then there were protests, furious protests in response to the death of Freddie Gray. And when I was a reporter at the time, and I was reading the coverage and listening to it on television, and I noticed that all of the news coverage said that the violence began when protesters threw rocks. And that was the moment that it really clicked into view for me, that when violence is done by the more powerful entity to the less powerful entity, it's not even really discernible as violence. That it's when the less powerful entity responds and challenges that it's disruptive, chaotic. It's not how the power structure is supposed to work. And then it's notable as violence. Once you start thinking about things this way, you will hear it everywhere you go. The number of people who are talking about the attack on Brett Kavanaugh and his family, the left-wing attack. Brett Kavanaugh was accused of literally physically attacking another human being. And yet the language that is used in his defense is the language of victimhood, the victimhood of the powerful, whose ascent to power and further accumulation of power is impeded in any way by a challenge from less powerful people who themselves are saying we're attacked in some way. Once you hear how those power reversals happen, you will see them, you will hear them every day with regard to the power dynamics around you. So we are sent those messages in such tiny ways. The way I have in the book a whole list of the men who lost their jobs, some of the powerful men who lost their jobs during Me Too, including ones who were accused of serial, predatory, violent rape, being talked about as if they had been killed. And that was language that was like in the New York Times. It was not from reactionary right-wing sites. It was the casual conversation of death and murder being applied to powerful men who had been removed from multi-million-dollar jobs after having been accused, in some cases, of violent rape, that they had been killed. Barry Diller said of Charlie Rose, who was accused by 35 women who'd worked for him of really grotesque instances of harassment and assault. Charlie Rose ceases to exist. He's fine. He's in a mansion in Long Island. He exists. Tom Brokaw, who nobody even came for Tom Brokaw. One woman told a story in a newspaper of how he'd once tried to kiss her against her will. She had like 45 really strong corroborating witnesses, but it was a minor story. Like no one was calling for Tom Brokaw to resign. And he wrote this letter in the middle of the night where he said he'd been perp walked and taken to the guillotine. stripped of his honor. And it was like, dude, you're fine. Somebody just told a story about how you tried to kiss them in the 90s. Like, it's okay. Anyway, we're told all the time that our challenges to power and that our anger about power abuse is problematic, that we're the aggressors, that our aggression is ultimately going to hurt our cause, right? That we're going to, if we keep acting in this disruptive way that's not civil, it's actually going to hurt the left, it's going to hurt Democrats. This is language we hear all the time. Some of it is probably rooted in truth because there is real censure for less powerful people who express their fury at oppression or subjugation. But I thought it was really important to look back and look at the instances in which those challenges to power, and there are many of them, have resulted in alterations to that power structure.
So we have time for one more question, and then I'm going to take it out to the audience. But I think just coming back to this idea of control, I mean, it's a systemic issue rather than, you know, getting mad individually. And so one of the things that we're seeing in this moment is a wave of women who are running for office, which seems like a very concrete thing beyond, you know, a handful of men losing their jobs. It seems like a very concrete result of some of the, you know, anger that is erupting among women. Do you sort of see that kind of representation as a lasting development from this moment, or is it too soon to know?
I think it's too soon to predict. I mean, I wouldn't even venture to predict what's going to happen in the midterms, you know? Like everybody else here, I have guesses, and they change sometimes every day. But I do think that politics is one of the areas where you can correct power imbalance, and it's still taken us so long to get anywhere near it, right? But, you know, in the wake of last fall's #MeToo movement, there was a lot of talk about, like, it's not just about punishing guys, it's about altering who has power within these industries. But of course, in many industries, you can't just bring women who've left back to the, you know, to senior vice presidencies or to partnerships or to whatever, like if they've left in large numbers, as we know many have from many of the powerful industries in which there was power abuse or harassment, you can't just bring them back from their jobs in other industries and install them at the top. Politics is one of the only fields, bizarrely, that's actually susceptible to quick change. And we've seen that over the past couple of years. We saw it even in the special elections, you know, in advance of these midterms in 2017, where so many women who were really livid in the wake of the 2016 election ran. You had candidates like Danica Rome in Virginia who was a transgender woman who ran against a man who'd put in place the transphobic bathroom bill and beat him. There was a woman named Ashley Bennett in New Jersey who was so furious at a local, like, I think it was a freeholder was the local official who'd made a joke about women going to the Women's March about, like, who's going to cook me dinner, that she came back and ran against him and won, and now she's the freeholder, right? There are all kinds of examples. So many of the women who are running and who won their primaries in historic numbers. What is currently true is that there are historic numbers of women in so many categories, in gubernatorial races, in Senate races, in House races, and in state legislative races. Every one of them is record-breaking this year. And of course, we know that was one of the results after the confirmation of Clarence Thomas, is that even though, by many measures, Anita Hill lost, was not believed, was treated with disrespect and disregard by a Senate judiciary, the process gave the United States and a view of the whiteness and maleness of that Senate judiciary that had treated her so poorly. And one of the reactions was that women ran. They wanted to change that whiteness and maleness of our representative bodies. And so they ran for office, and the next year there was a historic year of the woman, which is terribly depressing in retrospect because the great historic year of the woman meant that 4 women were elected to the Senate. Woo! But it was a historic number. And so that process, that reaction was already happening in advance of what we've just seen with the Blasey Ford Kavanaugh testimony, right? That politics is, you can change power in politics not easily, because you need fundraising and you need networks, and it's hard in many ways for non-traditional candidates, i.e. not powerful white guys, to run for office and win. And yet, it's possible. And especially if part of your politicized anger for those who are furious and not running for office are building the networks to support those who run for office. So donating money at higher rates and doing the door knocking and voter registration and canvassing and participating in groups that are creating an infrastructure that is outside of the Democratic Party. In part, that kind of work is also enabling the candidacies of non-traditional candidates, which is why we have these historic numbers. But that doesn't mean a couple things. A, that they're going to win in November. There are all kinds of decks stacked against them, including the enormous, yesterday the Supreme Court upheld a law in North Dakota that is going to effectively disenfranchise Native American populations. In Georgia, where Stacey Abrams is running to be the first African American woman ever to be elected governor in the United States, her opponent, Brian Kemp, as Secretary of State, it turns out has held up the registrations of 53,000 voters, 70% of them black. Like, these mechanisms that are in control of this minority power, the Republican Party, those mechanisms have the ability to suppress dissent and mass action and social movements, and that's real. And so that's part of what we're up against. And the other thing is, even if everybody does win in November, right? Even if it's a giant blue wave and the House is turned, I want to believe that the Senate can turn, but I'm not particularly optimistic about that. But even if we have a great result, there should be that's not remotely the end. And if we have a bad result, that's not the end either. The thing that happened last week, which is the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, ensures that every single person in this room, including the college students and undergraduates, are going to be spending the rest of their lives fighting this battle.
Staying angry for a really long time.
Right, and that the anger at what we're going to see, and it's going to be fucking awful. And that we should be angry at it. And that anger can serve as a fuel for participation in the kind of movements and organizing and activism that is pretty much our only prayer at this point of surviving. But also know that I don't mean to suggest that all anger or all women's anger is progressive, because there's enormous anger deployed on the right. And there's enormous anger deployed on behalf of a power system and on behalf of a white patriarchy, and that's potent too. That's part of what elected Donald Trump. So I have no predictions. It's going to be really hard, but it needs to be hard.
But the anger needs to be turned into participation.
Yes.
It needs to be turned
Yes.
into action.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Evie Larson. Thank you so much for coming. I'm a Scripps senior majoring in politics. And with the hearings of Dr. Ford, I was really amazed and inspired by the video that became really viral of the women addressing Senator Flake in the elevator. And then after that, his response to have an FBI investigation. But it also felt as though, like, listening to a lot of different podcasts and watching what was happening, right after that, he voted Kavanaugh out of committee. So it felt like there was a difference made, that he went towards the FBI investigation, but then through that, it was an investigation.
Was a giant sham.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so where does this, because that anger was so inspiring to me, and I thought was very well addressed and spread around Facebook and everything, so people could see it, and I shared it with everyone I know. But where can it have lasting effect in an institution, like through the bureaucracy, not necessarily in just this like snap of or video of a senator being accosted by these women and then changing his mind in a way that didn't end up really mattering, or at least in my perspective?
That's a great question. And the answer is kind of complicated, but I would start with the fact that you said that it was really inspiring to you, and that everybody you know saw it, and that it spread through Facebook. A huge amount of where social movements start is in making things visible and making them audible. And especially when you're talking about a kind of righteous and long buried or long silenced anger being voiced in a way that is particularly affecting, that serves as a communicative and connective tool between women. So I agree that anger, I think the Anna Maria Archila and Maria Gallagher, who were the women who confronted Jeff Flake in that elevator, is fascinating because it came on the heels the day after we'd seen a very traditional view of what anger is permissible and what anger is not. There was no way that Christine Blasey Ford could have gone into that hearing room, guns blazing, screaming, even though she had every reason in the world to be furious. But had she been, it would have worked against her rhetorically. She would have been written off as unhinged and emotional and performative and playing the victim. And then and it's not just that she wasn't allowed to be angry, but Brett Kavanaugh was. It was that Brett Kavanaugh got to use his anger to amplify his point. He got to use it as a tool to suggest that drove home how correct and righteous he was. And it worked, right? It worked. It persuaded the powerful people. So there was this very boxed in traditional old view of what rhetorical tools were available to the woman in the situation and then to the man. And then the next day, there is this instance of two women protesters confronting Flake, and it was so powerful. Part of what is powerful is that there was the video and the audio of their shaking voices. The demand is really beautiful. The demand that he look them in the eye, that he addressed them as human, and that for masses of women around the country who were feeling impotent and furious and didn't have anybody to yell at, that was important and energizing and connective and let people know that somebody was yelling at these guys, right? And that has value within a mass movement. Even if the reason that we're all angry is because they had the power to make a sham investigation and push this guy through anyway. Like, that's why we're angry, is because they have that grip on power, where they don't have to listen. They don't have to respond. The fact that he made a show of responding, I mean, my argument is that was good in that it extended the conversation even longer. I think the longer we had this conversation, even though I sort of knew always it was going to end with this guy being appointed to the court, because that is the power they have. That's the power they got when Donald Trump became president. And that was always what they were going to do. The fact that it extended over a period of weeks and we got to keep talking about it and hearing from more women, that has value moving forward. And it doesn't, if we could fix it, and sometimes there are instances where pressure applied. I think the repeal of the ACA was a great example of that in the spring of 2017. They had the votes to repeal Obamacare. Like, they could have done it the first week, but the first week there was a women's march, and then there were women who rushed to the airport and objected to the travel ban. And there were so many protests that actually delayed them. And then by the time they got around to trying to repeal the ACA, there were so many protesters who were clogging the phone lines and sending postcards to senators, applying enough pressure that it actually persuaded 3 Republican senators to vote against repeal. And that's a rare instance in which that kind of pressure actually has an immediate kind of pressing the lever effect. But usually, I mean, that's much harder to achieve, and that's what we just saw with Flake. No, he didn't change his vote. And no, whoever, Ben Sass, who gave the moving speech about listening to women, or whoever it was, no, they were all full of shit. They weren't going to change their votes, and because they had the power not to. They didn't have to. And they could get Susan Collins to join them. But the expression itself has value, because it let those women who are angry around the country, they saw it. They felt inspired by it. They understood their anger as righteous, and echoing these women who they could view, as communicators for them. And that's going to be important moving forward in the days and the months and the years and the decades. And these things take really long times. It's 9 years after Rosa Parks sits on that bench, 9 years and 10 years before you have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And if we could make the changes like that, even if they had not confirmed Kavanaugh, they would have confirmed somebody else who's going to do all the same things. I wish they hadn't. I would have taken the other, right? I would always take the win, right? But they were still going to exert ultimately the same power over the majority. And they did it this time really directly in a way that exposed how hollow their promises were. But I think that the value of that rage as a signal sent out to millions of women is gonna persist long term.
Okay. My question is, do you feel more betrayed by Susan Collins than Jeff Flake? Do you feel she was pressured directly and indirectly? And do you feel that she will lose her seat in the Senate come her reelection? Because I know there's a fundraising page going on to fund her opponent. Do you think that will have an effect?
I would be shocked if she ran again. I mean, maybe she will. I don't know. My mother grew up on a farm in Maine, and I still spend a lot of time there, and it's a very red area. I would be very surprised if Susan Collins is running again, but I don't know. She may also try to run for governor. I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities, and I wouldn't predict what's going to happen to her. Do I feel more betrayed by her than by Jeff Flake? No, only because I don't necessarily feel more betrayed by the women and a group of women who have always acted on behalf of a white patriarchy, right? This is the conversation about white women. There are always incentives on offer to women willing to fight on behalf of a power system, even if that power system oppresses them in some way. And some of the incentives on offer are the fact that that power system offers them other advantages and privileges, and they derive benefits from white supremacy. And this immediately takes us back to the 53% of white women who voted for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. That was the least surprising thing about 2016. White women have voted for Republicans since 1952, with the exception of 1992 and 1996, which were, and those were years in which Bill Clinton ran in 92 and ran on an extremely racially charged, tough-on-crime platform and left the campaign trail in the middle to go back and execute Ricky Ray Rector, a black man in Arkansas, and sent very explicit messages about race. And white women voted for him in 92. And then in 96, a bunch of them voted for Ross Perot, which means the majority didn't vote for Republicans, but it's kind of a quirk. This is one of the ways that white patriarchy works, and the thinker who's been really instructive for me on this is Brittany Cooper, who's the author of an incredible book called Eloquent Rage, a black feminist finds her superpower. And she's the one who sort of taught me that the way white patriarchy works is it extends benefits to men via patriarchy across races, so that men of all races can enjoy advantages of patriarchal power within their relationships and their workplaces and economically. And it extends the benefit of white supremacy to white women. And the hope is that those who get some of the advantages of white supremacy will work to uphold it and defend it. Brittany's argument is that in part this is why black women, women of color, who are not extended any of those incentives, are the ones who have been the leading thinkers and organizers of many of the social movements from which they are later erased. And true. So I am rarely surprised to see women, people say working against their own interests, but in fact, to some degree, they're working toward their own interests from other angles. I am rarely, I just wouldn't say I'm more horrified to see it than I am to see, powerful white men abusing their power, right? That's really bad too. And I sometimes think we let the white guys off the hook when we focus only on the white women, because it's this is the white women are a problem. It's a lot of what I write my book about, are those forces and the way they play for white women.
You have a section called "What's the Matter with
White Women?" Right? It's one of my personal obsessions, and one of my jobs I feel going forward is as a white woman, is to address the white supremacy within a women's movement and the white supremacy that keeps white women from working in coalition with women of color. However, when we talk about that, I feel like we often let the white men, who 65% of them voted for Donald Trump, off the hook. So I wouldn't say I'm more, but no, it was awful. I don't expect anything better from Susan Collins. I really don't. I've never been one who thinks that Susan Collins is really secretly a cool moderate. She made one good vote.
Okay, we have time for one very quick question and one quick answer.
I'm sorry, I talk a lot.
Thanks for your talk there. In your long-form interview, you mentioned how reporting this piece gave you a sort of like socially sanctioned like place to be angry. And so going off of that, I was wondering if you could talk about what do you think is and what do you think should be the place of anger in journalism?
Well, I'm not a believer actually in the notion of objectivity in journalism. I don't think it's really possible, and I think it leads to a lot of really dishonest both sidesism within my industry. And this notion that to somehow be objective or fair means to give equal weight to like two sides of an issue where there's clearly one side that that has more fact and reality behind it. But that doesn't mean that I think all journalism should be angry. I think anger is one in a range of rhetorical expressions, and I'd like lots of the people in whom it is discouraged as an option to feel freer to use it, but that doesn't also, none of my book is trying to tell people that they're supposed to be angry in new ways, because especially for women, we're already told in 15,000 ways every day how we should be angry or not angry or control our anger or use our tone or whatever. This is not about that. If anything, it's about listening for other people's anger, being curious about it, hearing what it is, and integrating it into our understanding. So I guess I also wouldn't suggest that within journalism, there needs to be more anger. I wish that we could read the angry, often opinion writing, of people objecting to power abuse and give it more respect and treat it as politically consequential rather than as simply disruptive and problematic.
But I think there's a difference between angry writing,
right,
and writing about.
Right. I'm an angry person. I'm an angry person. I have written out of anger, but not all the time. I mean, I'm angry about a lot of things and informs my work, but certainly not everything I write or say comes out in an angry tone. And again, I want to emphasize that a lot of anger in political writing comes from the right and comes on behalf of a power structure. And that's actually a lot of, there are entire networks dedicated to that. And then the networks that sort of exist purportedly to give more voice to the left, I mean, anger's discouraged there because, in certain ways, there's an effort to make that more even and representative of both sides. So I do think one of the things that happens even within the media, within a political media, is that a right wing, and fundamentally the group that has political power, is given a lot of free rein to express their anger and to build entire media empires around it. And there's lots of messages that come to the left that say we have to be temperate. We don't want to cause a backlash. We don't want to be uncivil. We don't want to make them upset. We don't want to be too politically correct, right? There are all kinds of code words that tell us not to be angry about the kinds of inequities that many of us may be angry about. And so I think we should examine that. That doesn't mean that I'm advocating that everybody's just screaming at all times, right? In fact, a lot of the talking head cable news is that, and it's not particularly instructive. The raw anger isn't what I'm seeking. It's listening for the thoughtful and instructive and consequential fury of those who've rarely been given a choice or a platform to express it.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.